everybody. So this is our first panel discussion of the day, Harvesting Hope from Hiccups, Overcoming Standardization Hurdles. And our moderator is Ayden Férdeline. He's a Landecker Democracy Fellow with Humanity in Action, a public interest technologist who has worked directly with governments, industry, and civil society organizations to support responsible technological innovation with a focus on social impact. I'm going to hand over to him to introduce the rest of the panel, and let's get this started. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. It is day one of the Interledger Summit, and we're so grateful that you would come to our panel today. Delighted to be in company with you, as well as all of our esteemed panelists who I'll introduce in just a moment's time. My name is Ayden Férdeline. I'm a Landecker Democracy Fellow with Humanity in Action in collaboration with the Alfred Landecker Foundation. And we're assembled in Costa Rica today to discuss how we can assess the success of standards and protocols. The linchpin for this conversation was the deterioration of Twitter, or X as it is now known, and the early success of Threads, which Meta said would interoperate with the Fediverse and Mastodon. This led to some initial excitement that further down the line, this could positively impact the adoption of the Interledger protocol and the W3C web monetization standard. But as we will discuss today, standards can fail to be adopted even when they are technically brilliant. Before I bring in our panel, though, I have a question for you in the audience. And I'd just like to ask for a show of hands. The question is, if no one is using a standard, is it a success or is it a failure? Would you raise your hand if you think that a standard can be successful if no one is using it? Okay. We have one hand, actually, maybe one and a half.
Yeah, I would add that as long as it doesn't cause any harm not using it, it might be okay. If
Okay,
you
so
know that it exists,
yeah.
but maybe you don't want to use it.
Okay.
If you create harm, it's not good.
So I just want to capture your comments for the recording, unless you want to grab the microphone and add it yourself. Okay, so a caveat was added from a member of the audience that as long as it does not cause any harm, then that's great. So then I'll also do the inverse, which is raise your hand if you think that a standard can be successful if not many people are using it. We have a lot of hands for that response, and so I think that might be where the consensus is for now. But we will revisit this question at the end of today's discussion. And we'll also invite your feedback as well, and any questions that you have along the way. Just raise your hand and I'll get a microphone to you. So for now, I'm going to bring in our first panelist, who is Chris Buckridge. He is an independent advisor, consultant, and commentator with more than 2 decades of experience in the internet governance space. Chris, do you have any examples of standards and protocols that were technically sound, yet struggled to be adopted, and if so, why was that the case?
Why, yes, I do. Now, first off, thanks, Ayden, for the invitation to be here as part of this panel. It's my first time at an Interledger Summit, and my first time really in the fintech kind of space at all, so I feel a little fish out of watery, but also very interested to see a lot of the parallels and sort of intersections here. As someone coming from internet governance, internet standardization background, also worth noting that it's a very timely discussion we're having here, because it's actually 50 years and 1 day since the birth of the TCP/IP protocol, which I think Stefan referred to as magical this morning in his presentation. So actually that was the day in 1973 that the first article from Vint Cerf and Bob Kahn was received at the IEEE journal in which it was subsequently published, and that formed the basis of the protocol which the internet as we know it is based upon. So in sticking to that theme of TCP/IP, the example that is usually thrown around, and I'm going to throw it around again here, of a standard that was perfectly workable and adopted, but didn't really catch fire, is IPv6. And so the example, trying to read the room here. I'll give a little bit of background on what IPv6 was. The internet as we know it is based on a network of addresses which move data packets from one to the other. Now, the internet was originally designed based around IPv4, which is a pool of addresses of 2 to the power of 32, about 4 billion. It turns out we actually need a lot more than 4 billion addresses with the internet as we know it now. And this was recognized in the early 90s, actually. And the powers that be, the people involved in the Internet Engineering Task Force, developed a new protocol, IPv6. Now this is based around 128 bits, which gives a mind-blowing number of possible addresses. I'm not going to try and say what the number actually is, but would have and will sort us out for addresses for well into the future. Now, one thing that they didn't do in making this protocol was to make it backward compatible with IPv4. So the idea was, okay, we're going to come up with a new address format and people will migrate to that. So they'll say, okay, we're moving from IPv4 to IPv6. Now, I first started working in this space in 2003, and I was working in a communications role. And when I went for the interview, I said to my manager-to-be, what are some of the communications challenges that we have in this? And his answer to me was, well, we're trying to get people to adopt IPv6. Now, if I was to go for the same job today, I probably would get something of a similar answer in terms of we're trying to convince people to move to IPv6. That's been one of the real challenges for that internet and for internet operators. Now, there are many people who've sort of said this was a huge mistake on the part of those making the standards, that they should have just made it backward compatible. But I think one of the interesting perspectives I've read, and I'm quoting here from a post on an old mailing list, came from Paul Wilson, who is a veteran of the Asia-Pacific Internet, currently head of the Asia-Pacific Network Information Centre in Australia. But what he said was, the only significant sin of the IPv6 developers, at least the only one which is relevant here, is to have underestimated the coming success of the internet. So which is to say, when they actually developed that protocol, the idea was, okay, the internet is sort of increasing, but we're not going to have so many people that they won't be able to make a jump from one to the next. Now, history, of course, tells that around the end of the 90s, there was actually a very steep upward incline in terms of the number of people using the internet and how that grew. And it quickly became clear that it wasn't going to be easy to simply transition everyone who was at that point using the internet, who was running networks, across to a new protocol. And I think that's the real key point that I see as important here in this story, but also relevant maybe for some of the other standardization challenges and maybe for Interledger, is that it's often not technical aspects or technical elements that are the issue for standards. You can get a technical spec perfect, it can be a great standard, but there are economic issues, there are social issues, there are political issues that play into whether a standard is actually going to be successful. And how you plan for that, how you gauge that, is something that we often haven't cracked. It's something that, as we said here, was not identified in that initial discussion of IPv6, but it's equally important to any of the technical factors involved. So we need to find ways to build that sort of multi-stakeholder understanding and perspective and build it into the standardization development process itself. I'll stop there.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Chris. Next, I will bring into our discussion Stephanie Perrin. She is a privacy consultant with many years of experience in government working on privacy law and standards, as well as in the private sector. And she currently volunteers at ICANN, representing the interests of non-commercial stakeholders in that international multi-stakeholder environment. And the question I have for you, Stephanie, would be around the challenges that exist in multi-stakeholder engagement in policy fora, and particularly, why do we often see standards developed without any meaningful engagement from those who should be at the table?
Thanks very much, and it's lovely to be here with you. You'll recall the panel that we had just before lunch, where we kind of left on the discussion of how do we solve these challenges. And the question that I had that I didn't get to was, where would the regulators meet were they to decide that they should develop some kind of a model law that they could share amongst themselves? Because while it was interesting to hear about what Brazil is doing with Colombia and Uruguay, that's not going to help Ukraine or Finland, for instance. They might be meeting their neighbors and coming up with a totally different model law. It'd be nice if we all thought with synchronicity at the same time, but we don't. History shows we don't. And I was in government, and I was there when the very beginnings of the Cybercrime Treaty started. And that was an initiative basically led by the United States and the Netherlands, as I recall, taking it to the Council of Europe, because we didn't really have the internet up and running in a commercial sense at the time, and there was a recognition that cybercrime was going to blossom. Who knew? I wouldn't sit here and pretend that we thought it would get as bad as it is right now, an umpty-trillion-dollar industry, no doubt. But that initiative started, and it has been very difficult to get people to standardize and bring their laws up to date, even with a fairly powerful focus of countries promoting it. They have different traditions. Everybody's got different resources in their home countries. That's one example of one of the things that I think we can look forward to with this banking challenge. If we can't get the regulators to move off of their narrow focus, then that's an issue that has to be dealt with very strategically. And so one of the multi-stakeholder challenges that I deal with, as Ayden says, I've been volunteering at ICANN for my sins for 11 years now. And anybody who knows ICANN knows how painful that can be. Trying to get privacy in, and it's only because GDR has massive fines that we've moved anything. That has moved people. They could just come and say, no, we're not doing it. We're going to continue to release name, address, and cell phone on the internet to any crook who wants it. And there wasn't much anybody, including all of the data protection commissioners, could do about it. So these are the kinds, I don't mean to be a downer. You're going to leave this and go next door and say, I'm not listening to Debbie Downer in that room. But these are the real blocks in things. You can have a fabulous piece of technology, and I think I get to talk about one later, don't I? Yes. And it'll just die, and the patents will expire, and somebody will buy them so they can bury them in the deepest hole. And it won't be because of the tech. It'll be because of the money and the interests and the geopolitics involved in it. And so it's a very important aspect of this. And I haven't talked much about standards bodies, but that's probably enough out of me for now, right?
We can always ask you that, your next question.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. And finally, I'll bring into our discussion Jeremiah Lee, who is an Interledger ambassador working on web monetization support in federated social network apps. He previously worked on API integrations at Fitbit, Spotify, and at Stripe. So, Jeremiah, just to bring the points raised by Chris and Stephanie home, could you speak to why you believe the proposed W3 standard for web monetization has, one, the best chance for disrupting online advertising as the primary monetization model online, but also, secondly, why it has not been rapidly adopted?
This is such a great question because I think it hits at some of the points that are being raised about you have this element of idealism and something that you think is really good, but then it has to face the realities of the real world. And so I want to give a little bit of the history on how we arrived at decentralized social networks even having any traction this year. And the first way that I think about this is just the general trend that any innovation is going to start out proprietary because someone has an idea and the first thing you need to do is actually try to get that idea to work at all. And then once you have that idea, perhaps it spreads and then becomes really successful. And what we see is like these proprietary ideas then end up getting commoditized. and that's to everyone's benefit. They become commoditized, typically through a standardization process. And this is so that the next wave of innovation can happen. If everyone has to rebuild and re-innovate everything that has like a common convention that already exists, then they're spending their time on that thing instead of working on the next innovation. So we have to move from proprietary innovation to basically a standard way of doing everything so that we can keep moving things forward. But every time that you do that, you're going to be basically taking value from the group that created that value initially and basically giving it to the public commons. And so someone is always losing something, but it's for the greater benefit of society. So when we start looking at social networks, there's been a long history of them. And there's been efforts to try to take those innovations within social networks and standardize them through various standardization processes. And that's been going on for a long time. I actually worked on one at the very start of my career called Open Social. And this was at the time before the iPhone. It was basically trying to take an innovation from Facebook and how Facebook apps worked and make it available universally to the other two popular social networks at the time, which were MySpace and Google Orchid, which don't exist anymore. I mean, there were some good standards and some great people involved in that, but I think the pace of innovation at that time in social networks was just too fast to really standardize. We didn't know that social networks were going to continue to evolve in the types of interactions in the user experiences that we'd have. But a lot of the people who worked on that original effort kept working on that. And then they basically came up with 4 standards that are being used today by most of the federated social networks. But up until Elon Musk bought Twitter last year, it was just me and a bunch of web developer nerds hanging out on Mastodon together. Like, there was just absolutely no interest in using these technology standards or open source software that had implemented them. And so it doesn't matter if you have the best standard. You can have the exact same app with the exact same user experience and features, but the primary value of a social network is people. Like, you go to a social network to interact with people, and if you can't get those people to come join you, your standard doesn't really mean anything. And the authors of the current specs, they actually tried to get Facebook and other network companies to engage with them and engage in the standards process, and none of them would participate. But now what we're seeing is Meta launching Threads with this promise that it's actually going to use one of these standards. And I think they're only interested in doing it right now at this point because they're not the dominant player in tweeting. Right? They have Threads, which is their Twitter competitor, and so they now know that an open standard is going to help them get adoption because they're not the incumbent in that sort of social network. But they could have been interested in it when they were building Instagram, and they were not. And in fact, they actually closed off Instagram's APIs for interoperability even more last year. So we have to look at the way that Meta makes money, because they're the ones who are going to be disrupted by a standardization process. And the way that that works right now is basically surveillance advertising. It's individually targeted advertising and a curated newsfeed where businesses are paying for placement inside of newsfeeds. Well, when you start using ActivityPub standards and these things, like Meta can't control, it can't show ads to people not using its specific product. It can't manipulate your specific timeline on your community server because it's not controlling the user experience. So this makes me question like how much long-term commitment Meta has to adopting a particular open standard. So if these standards are going to survive, then like we have to start thinking about a viable economic model for these things that are looking to replace the centralized social networks. And this is where my work with Interledger comes into play. So I've been trying to apply the web monetization specification to this new social network model.
Thank you, Jeremiah. So I think I'll throw the mic back to you, Stephanie, to take us on a trip down memory lane, if you don't mind, on why good standards fail and why we can't just go out there and make a standard that everyone is going to adopt.
Well, I have so many examples, but the first one that leaps to mind is in Canada, before we passed a data protection law for the private sector that I worked on, we had developed a voluntary standard under the quality stream of standards, because basically privacy protection is good management of personal information. So you can do a management standard just as you would for chemicals or the kinds of things that were sprouting up in the 90s as quality standards to facilitate global trade. And that's part of the thrust that was behind the European privacy laws. We could debate all for the rest of the day about whether it's easier to try to harmonize laws, as I said a minute ago, or harmonize standards. We thought maybe a standard might work better. We were blocked in taking that to the next step, which would have been an ISO quality standard, basically by the Americans, who the tech companies hated quality standards, saw them as a cost, and the rest is history. So we never got that out of the door. Furthermore, I infuriated the standards group that we'd been working with by just attaching it as a standard to the law when we brought the law in, so they couldn't make money off the sale of the standards. This is another one of the problems with the standards bodies, is they want the revenue from selling the standards. So Tom, Dick, and Harry cannot, particularly small business, they can't implement the standard unless they've got the money to buy umpteen copies at several $100 a throw, usually, of these standards. And then, of course, they need to explain them, so they have to get the teaching arm of the standards body to come in and teach them how to implement it, because not all standards are clear and straightforward. So that's sort of one trip down memory lane. I did promise or threaten to tell you the story of DigiCash back in the 90s. Because I was working on privacy, I got to go to the International Data Commissioners Conferences. And in 1994, there was one in The Hague, hosted by the then Dutch Data Commissioner, Peter Hustings, and they focused on privacy-enhancing technologies. David Chaum, one of the forefathers of crypto, had started a company called DigiCash in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam, and they had operating an anonymous road toll device that you stuck on your dashboard, and you could pay your road tolls without anybody knowing. It was an implementation of his anonymous cash, DigiCash. He also had a trial with the Deutsche Bank for implementing DigiCash. Now that was 1994, folks. Basically, all of that never came to light. And if you're driving through the United States and you're being tracked everywhere you go with these wretched road tolls, we're just as bad in Canada, don't get me wrong here. It's just there are more road tolls in the States. This was a horror that stood before us back then. We've now accepted it, that we're going to be tracked every minute wherever we go in our cars. But it needn't have been that way. Now, why did that fail? In my view, he had a very strong team of cryptographers and engineers developing great protocols. It was working on what are those roads in Germany where you go?
Autobahn?
The ones you can go any old speed you want. Well, it was working even at those speeds. It wasn't the tech, it was the lack of engagement with where the barriers were going to be. I mean, governments probably already thought they might like that data. Police forces, I'm sure, knew they wanted that data, and here we are today. So the strategy for how to take a project, a tech project somewhere, and get allies that will back you, because you can't do this alone just because you've got a good idea and it would solve a tech problem. I think this is we all have our nemesis when it comes to our feelings of superiority, and engineers think they can design the perfect tech, and that's all you need. I hear it all the time from them. No, you can be stopped by an absolute lummox who is getting a whole lot of money with the existing tech, and they're not going to let go of that money. So that's my moral preaching for today.
A nice, happy message at that. Thank you, Stephanie.
Back to Debbie Downer.
Chris, what say you? Does the winner take all pace of innovation get everything right? What does it not get right? If a standard or protocol isn't being adopted, could that be a sign that it just isn't meeting consumer demands?
I think that's one possibility. I think honestly that Stephanie's outlined one case of where that probably wasn't actually the reason why the standard wasn't adopted. I think IPv6 is probably a little bit closer to that, where it wasn't meeting the needs of the actual users. But I think what's necessary is to sort of identify all of the users, and not just those who are, you say, okay, these are the people who are using it, but also those stakeholders that are perhaps tangentially related. And that's where you get regulators, that's where you get sort of other parts of society, but particularly sort of the public sector is a very powerful force there. And I think, sort of coming back, not to that question you asked, but to maybe the original question of whether a protocol or a standard can be successful if it's not being widely used. One of the protocols that I was looking a little bit at in sort of preparing for this is another that's going through some W3C discussions at the moment, and it's a decentralized social networking protocol that Project Liberty, an American/European organization, is looking into doing. And one of the people they've got working with them on that is Dave Clark, who's another of the very sort of early important internet pioneers. And there was an interview I was reading where he was being asked what is the secret to success in building a protocol. And he had three things. He said one, functionality, so that's a given. You need to have the technical stuff right. But then the other is finding your collaborators and building a coalition. And so the fact that, this is a very technical guy, but putting into that context that actually the success of a protocol relies on building that coalition to actually move it forward, to actually get it to where it's going is I think really fundamental. Now I think the other thing that jumps out at me a little, and I was saying this last night, it's probably an idea that needs some closer interrogation. But where we previously, in the earlier days of the internet, saw standards, protocols being developed that met technical needs, they were move more packets, move packets faster from this place to the other, make sure that they get there in one piece. What we're now seeing, and I think Interledger is an example of this, but also the decentralized social networking protocol, maybe even looking at the Signal protocol, is technical standards, absolutely technical standards, but where the primary driver is actually more something social or political or economic. Now, I mean, that's interesting, and that I think at least shifts the goalposts in terms of what do you define as success for a protocol or a standard. Because if you've identified as the main reason for developing and pushing this standard as a certain social outcome, that social outcome might not require universal or even broad adoption. It might sort of work if a certain demographic is reached and is using that protocol. But yeah, as I said, that may need some more interrogation. That's a bit of an off-the-cuff idea, but thanks.
Thanks so much, Chris. So Jeremiah, as the sole member of our panel that can actually code, why is it that you build technology? Is it to ensure that standards and protocols are adopted in the real world, or are there other motivations that are at play when you're building things?
Yeah, I guess there's kind of two types of software developers. There are people who just really love to code. Like, code is their Lego, and it's, that code in itself excites them. And there's another group of software engineers who are more interested in the problems that can be solved, and code is the tool that you use to solve those problems. I'm definitely in the latter camp. I would say I'm probably a fairly mediocre programmer compared to some of the brilliant minds that I have worked with. But what really gets me excited is that there are these problems that can be solved with code, and my interest in the code is doing a good enough job to solve that problem, and not like, oh, I can optimize this random piece of logic at a very low level. Like that just doesn't do much for me. So yeah, I mean, I describe myself as like a human and technologist, and specifically like in that order. So like I am a technologist by trade, but like I really care about advancing humanity in some way with that work. And so that was like one of my motivations when I joined Fitbit as a early employee. It's like this company that had a technology product, but its mission was to help people live happier, healthier lives. And that just really resonated with me. And then I specifically worked on API integrations between like Fitbit devices and a lot of different other products. So the company certainly wanted to sell more devices because that was the primary revenue model of the company. But I really appreciated that that was not the key performance indicator on the work that I was leading at the company. I think the founders genuinely had an interest on, is this product actually helping people live healthier, more active lives as the primary goal? Because that's a better long-term goal. You can sell a lot of devices, but if people just stop using that device, the benefit's not being realized. And so that's really, I love that they actually had that in mind and talked about that, because like the things that, metrics that they gave us for doing this work were like, did we reduce churn? Did users actually stay longer using the product? The people who use these integrations basically continue to get benefit for a longer period of time. Did they keep buying devices because that means they want to keep getting benefit from some of the newer innovations? Yeah, it just showed like there was long-term impact, not just an immediate increase in some device sales. So yeah, like I really only care about a programming language or a framework or whatever, like if it helps improving humanity's existence in some way. So if I were to apply some key performance indicators for decentralized networking standards, it's not going to be like, is this protocol the best thing in the world? I can tell you right now, ActivityPub is a very flawed protocol, and a lot more people are using it now, and we're trying to work through those things. It's not the best thing. If it were to be redesigned today, it would probably look something much more closely like the Signal or the Matrix protocols, that are just some newer things, decentralized technologies that, yeah, were basically created in a post-Snowden world. But like, the key KPI should be like, are people able to interact with each other in a way that respects their privacy? Is the use of this social network no more harmful than any real-world social interaction? And if you're participating in the creator economy, like, have all the systemic barriers been removed from trying to earn money from that work? And so the stuff that I'm working on with Interledger in my ambassadorship is really looking at, are we answering those questions effectively? And that, the standard is just the way that the thing that we're using to accomplish those goals.
Thank you, Jeremiah. And I have one last question for each of our panelists before I'm going to open the floor to any questions that you have from the gallery. So start thinking of your questions now. But to start, Stephanie, and this is going to be the same question for each of our panelists, which is just really, because we are at the Interledger Summit, so let's take stock of the Interledger protocol. What do we think of it? Where do we think it is successful? Where do we think it maybe needs some improvement? What are some of those lever points for making improvements that we think we should be focusing some more energy on? Stephanie, could you kick us off?
Well, I'm very interested in exactly what Jeremiah was explaining, how much this can benefit the disenfranchised, frankly, small and medium business. There's a yawning gap opening. There's poverty growing. That is what attracts me to coming and speaking at Interledger. So I want this thing to work. And I'm confident that the engineers, whatever their motivations, whether they get high on coding or whether they need to see it implemented in society to get their kicks, I'm more on your side, I think, here. It doesn't matter to me. I see a lot of stumbling blocks based probably on my experiences, and I think you have this delicate balance. You don't want to go out and scare the world like David Chaum did with his anonymous. I spent quite some time for my sins at Zero Knowledge Systems trying to explain to governments why they should not be terrified. I was their chief privacy officer. Why they should not be terrified about the concept of secure anonymous credentials. We needed secure anonymous credentials. They never got off the ground. Did we do too successful a communications campaign at that point before we had gained enough allies, is the question that I would be asking at Interledger. Because if the folks that are making trillions of dollars passing payments around the world, the folks who are laundering their money successfully, the governments that are looking for more tax dollars. I remember way back in the 90s, two of my colleagues wrote a book on how to tax the internet. And believe me, the finance department liked that idea, and I suspect there's some people working on it right now because there's some big expensive problems to solve, cybercrime being, of course, one of them. So I think the priority ought to be, while the engineers work out the kinks, somebody's got to be focused on what's the communications plan, what's the ally attraction plan. I'm very impressed with the amount of work that's going on in communities, in disenfranchised communities, in, developing countries where you need to solve some very basic problems. But again, too much attention to that will arouse the sleeping giants who don't want to lose the amount of payment money they're getting. And so you need your allies. And I don't know enough about Interledger. You can tell me, or the audience can tell me, who are the allies out there that are really, really motivated to try and narrow that financial gap, to try and empower people to actually run successful small businesses and do micropayments and trade globally, even though they're tiny. I'm not sure how you find those allies. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. Chris, over to you.
I can't add much to what Stephanie said other than a plus one. I think the goal of a sort of frictionless money transfer protocol is a very good goal and something I absolutely support and would love to see move forward. There are a lot of actors who are very invested in the friction that is there, and I think there needs to be active coordination and strategization to think about how you mitigate that, how you address that fact, because the people who are invested in this, the companies, the actors who are invested in this have a lot of power, and yeah, you can't ignore that.
Thanks. Jeremiah?
So the last big tech company that I worked for was Stripe. And one of the things that, it's a US-based payments provider for people who don't know. The thing that really resonated with me about their mission statement was what they called the Global Payment and Treasury Network. And it's this idea that there should be programmable infrastructure for global money movement that's as easy as moving data in the cloud. And I absolutely love that vision. It's clear. Businesses, they just want to be able to accept money from any customer, wherever they live, whatever currency is convenient for them, and then pay out their own bills and whatnot just as easily as they're receiving those payments. And Stripe has made some really great progress towards that goal. And there's even some other companies out there that I think are making even better progress on that, like Wise. But the challenge is that Stripe and Wise are single companies. And this problem is too big for a single global monopoly to solve. And so that's really what the premise of the Interledger protocol had in appealing to me. Instead of having like this one global company that's trying to make money move magically, it is a protocol, and it is truly a network of financial institutions that are locally regulated and able to facilitate these sort of transactions. And this is also why I'm a bit of a crypto skeptic, just because I don't think cryptocurrencies can adequately address a lot of the financial regulations that we have in markets. And we have to remember that those regulations didn't just get invented on a whim. They were very hard fought for to exist, and often at great expense to individuals in the communities. Like, these regulations existed to protect people because they had experienced a great harm. So we can't just invent another system that subverts all of the learning that we've had from history. And I really appreciate that Interledger is trying to work with these local financial institutions to be able to globally connect them in a way to facilitate this great vision of global money movement. And so like the key success indicator should be like if customer A using currency A can send money to customer B using currency B. And does that happen quickly? Does it happen securely? does it happen with low fees? And we heard a lot about that sort of vision in the keynote earlier today. But the reality is, like, we're not there yet. And it's not because the protocol is not good enough. We are not there yet because people have not done the hard work to get financial institutions in their local markets to adopt the Interledger protocol in order to enable this. So to your point, like, the technology is the easiest part of this. Like, we've seen individual countries that have solved this problem within their country. We've seen the EU pretty much solve this within its continent. Like, we still have a lot of work to solve this problem in a lot more countries, and that's going to take some other forum that doesn't seem to exist just yet, so I'm excited that Interledger is trying to make that happen. And I'm also a macro optimist. I believe that this can happen. It's not going to happen next year, but I do believe it could happen within a decade. And so if any of this sounds interesting to you, I would encourage you to please come talk to the Interledger Foundation. Like, they're giving out reasonable amount of monies for people who are willing to do the hard work to start figuring out how to solve some of these problems in the local spaces without being prescriptive of how to do that.
Thank you so much, Jeremiah. We are almost at the top of the hour, but we still have time for a few questions from the audience if anyone would like to ask a question to our panelists.